The Age of Revolutions, Part 2, The French Revolution. The impact of the Enlightenment and disenchantment with absolute monarchy and bankruptcy. Lecture terms. This is part 2 of the lecture that we began with the American Revolution and the influence of the Enlightenment with the desire for governments based on popular sovereignty, on religious toleration, and on equality before the law it still holds true here with this revolution as well. But in order to really understand why the French Revolution began, we need to start with some of the issues that were going on in France economically in the late 1700s. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, France had lost a war with England in the mid-1760s. They had lost actually 2 wars that were fought on 2 different continents. The French and Indian War, which was fought in North America, and the 7 Years' War, which was fought on the continent of Europe. Ultimately, as I mentioned, when France lost these wars, they lost a lot of international clout as well as a lot of money. Wars cost money, and especially if you come out on the losing end of the war, your economic contributions are even heavier when it comes to paying the cost of the war. So by the time we get to the end of the 1700s, France is in a precarious position economically. Adding to the economic woes of France because of the wars that they lost to England, France had decided, in order to perhaps gain a little bit of their power back, maybe some of their lands back in North America, France had decided to back economically the American Revolution against England. Now, I mentioned before that the king in France at the time, Louis XVI, was an absolute monarch. He did not really care about the causes of the American Revolution. He did not really care that the American colonists were basing their justification for revolting on their opposition to absolute rule. The reason why Louis XVI and France were backing the Americans were because they wanted to smite England after the loss they had suffered. And like I said, they were hoping they could perhaps gain some of their power and their land back that they had lost in those wars. But after the American Revolution, the Americans will find it difficult to raise the tax revenues to pay the money back to France. And so it will take a while before America is able to pay its war debts. This puts France in an even more difficult position economically. By 1789, France is on the verge of total bankruptcy. And Louis XVI, as the absolute monarch, is faced with a dilemma. How can he raise new taxes in order to improve the economy of France, to pay their debts, as well as to revive the economy internally? Well, he ends up having to call upon an advisory body in France known as the Estates General in May of 1789 to try to get advice on how they could raise new taxes in France. The Estates General was, like I say, an advisory body only. It did not really have legislative power in France. As a matter of fact, the Estates General had not been called upon by any monarch in France since the early 1600s. The absolute monarchs in France that came about in the 1600s, of course, did not see any reason why they needed to call upon an advisory body for anything. If they have absolute power, they do not need to ask anyone's opinion on anything. So the fact that Louis XVI had to call the Estates General was an embarrassment. Now, the Estates General basically was made up of the three major classes in French society. The first estate would be representatives of the clergy living in France. The second estate were representatives of the nobility living in France. And the third estate was everyone else in French society, which went from the middle class on down to the lowest peasant. Now, the Estates General meeting that was called in May of 1789 meant that the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate folks had to now grapple with choosing representatives to go to this meeting. Of course, the third estate, which represented somewhere between 95 and 97% of the population, where the other two estates only represented the small percentage, that third estate had a bigger choice to make. Now, the majority of the reading public in this commoners class, this third estate, came from the upper middle class. They were folks who had owned businesses, who were merchants. They were the ones who had been indoctrinated into the Enlightenment brand of thinking. They were the ones who read the writings of the philosophes, and many of them had desires for reform. Many of these folks in the third estate, these middle class folks, which would be chosen to represent the entire third estate, which represented all of the commoners, 95% of the population, they were the ones who had thought that, if France is going to help bankroll the American Revolution so the Americans can gain a say in their own political future, throwing off the absolute monarch, then why shouldn't they be able to reform their government? The members of the Third Estate that were chosen to go to Versailles, to the meeting of the Estates General in May of 1789, felt as if they had an opportunity placed in their laps. Perhaps they could get the king and the first and second estates to agree to some reforms in the government of France while they are negotiating over what to do about the economic situation. Unfortunately, it will not work out as well as they had hoped. After the representatives of the three estates arrived at Versailles in May of 1789, right away those members of the Third Estate started to push for the other two estates and the king to perhaps change the way that the voting within the Estates General was done. When it came to advising the king on what to do next, they had hoped that they could change the way the votes had been done traditionally in the Estates General when they were held back before the early 1600s. The votes had always been vote by block, each estate getting one vote. That normally meant that the clergy and the nobility voted together, and they always sided with the king, since those were all of the privileged classes in French society. And that would mean that the third estate, with one vote that represented the largest percentage of the population, would only have that one vote, and they would always be outvoted. So the third estate representatives had a proposal. Perhaps we should do a vote by head, and in that way it would better represent the will of the people. Now, remember, this is not a vote for any kind of legislative action. At this point, the Estates General was just an advisory body to the king, but they were hoping that their will, their advice to the king, could be listened to, and perhaps with the changing in the votes, more reforms could be pushed through after they agreed to help with the economic situation. The king and the first and second estates would hear nothing about changing the way the voting was done. in the Estates General. As a matter of fact, they were so against it that when the Third Estate representatives arrived to one of the meetings in June of 1789, they found themselves locked out of the meetings. They were locked out of the palace at Versailles. And this ultimately led to the Third Estate taking some real actions, and this will lead to the beginning of the French Revolution. The Third Estate decides, those representatives of the Third Estate decide that they will go to a nearby tennis court. It was the only thing at Versailles that was large enough to hold them, since they were locked out of the real negotiations. And on this tennis court in June of 1789, the Third Estate takes an oath. Their oath is they will continue to meet as representatives of the real people of France until they can write a new constitution for France and create what would be a constitutional monarchy, limiting the power of the king along with the power of the people, creating a government, a new government based on popular sovereignty. And they called this entity, this body that they created, the National Assembly. They agreed that there would be elections that would take place on pretty much a yearly basis for the National Assembly. And all of the other two estates would also be welcomed into this new, what they were calling, legislative body. This will be a legislature. This is what they are hoping to create. The National Assembly will be formed, and ultimately the king and the First and Second Estates find it prudent to agree to go along with the Third Estate at this point. Since they represented roughly 95% of the population of France, the king, the nobles, and the clergy worried that there would be rebellion if they did not listen to what the Third Estate was saying at this point. And so they gave lip service to the Third Estate, and they said, okay, we'll go along with this idea. We'll just see where it goes. The National Assembly will move their meetings to Paris, the capital city of Paris, and they will begin their meetings in June of 1789. The king, however, did not prove to be very willing to work with the Third Estate, as he had said when they were on his property in the tennis court. This will lead ultimately to him sending royal troops to Paris for what he said was to, quote, keep an eye on the National Assembly, end quote. Ultimately, the people in Paris, the regular, common, working-class people living in one of the most populated cities in all of Europe, see this as an act of tyranny, as him sending the royal army in to crush the National Assembly. And this will lead them to react. As they see the royal troops arriving in Paris, the mobs of France storm the armory, which was in an old French prison called the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison that had been used primarily for political prisoners. By the way, Voltaire, the philosophe Voltaire, was one of the individuals who had spent some time in the Bastille at some point in his life. But by this point, the Bastille was used primarily as an armory to house the arms for the royal army. There were a few, maybe a dozen or two, political prisoners still being held there, but for the most part it was an armory. So the mobs of Paris, they were called the sans-culottes, which basically means without pants, but they didn't really run around without pants on. It just meant without knee breeches. They saw themselves as different than those nobility that wore the knee breeches. Anyhow, the mobs, the regular folks in Paris, stormed the Bastille to try to get to the weapons before the royal troops could do so. And this will eventually cause the Bastille to be sacked, set on fire, and this is known as the fall of the Bastille. It happens on July 14th, 1789. The king, of course, continued to send his troops in to try to stop these folks from taking over the Bastille, but ultimately it ended up in a victory, if you will, for the commoners. The royal forces had to be called off, and the fall of the Bastille represents the true beginning of the French Revolution. The Bastille ultimately represents the old regime, the ancient regime, as they called it. But even though there weren't a lot of political prisoners that were freed, it's very symbolic, if you will. The fall of the Bastille means that the people of France will no longer accept an absolute monarch. They will support the National Assembly's efforts to try to create a constitutional monarchy. The regular commoners of France, who represent 95% of the population. July 14th, 1789 is kind of like, for France, is kind of like July 4th, 1776 for America. It's known as their kind of Independence Day, if you will, and it's still celebrated to this very day as a national holiday. After the fall of the Bastille, the National Assembly will continue to work on creating a new constitution for France. They are not trying to overthrow the king at this point. This is the beginning of what we call the moderate phase of the French Revolution. They desire a constitutional monarchy where the king's power would be limited and balanced against the power of the people, which is represented in the National Assembly, similar to what we had in England after the Glorious Revolution, a constitutional monarchy with a legislative body whose powers check and balance against the powers of the king. In order to write a new constitution, they had to have something to be the foundation of that new constitution. What are going to be the basic things they want to enshrine in this new way of governing their society? And this leads to the writing of the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, which you are reading for this class this week. The Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen eventually becomes sort of the foundation or the basis for the new government in France that will be based on popular sovereignty. Ultimately, this will be the basis of the government, which will enshrine Enlightenment ideals: popular sovereignty, equality before the law, and balancing the power of the king with the power of the people. After the storming of the Bastille and after the writing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the work in the National Assembly will continue towards writing a new constitution for France. Some of the nobles came along, seeing the handwriting on the wall. If you can't beat them, join them. Some clergy did as well, but not all of them did. Some of them will leave France, will find it prudent to leave France, not liking the new way things were going. We also need to note that the king kind of felt as if he was forced into this new way of governing in France, and he was not happy with his power being limited. And even though he was eventually brought from Versailles to live in Paris once again, so the National Assembly could, quote, work with him on creating this new government, it really was so they could keep their eye on him and he couldn't raise an army against them again after the storming of the Bastille. But he would live there in the old royal palace in Paris with his family, but he was not happy about this, the way things were going. And from the late 1789 Through 1790 and into 1791, there continued to be more and more problems in France. Just because they are forming a new government does not mean the old problems go away. The economic problems were still in place, and unfortunately there were a series of bad harvests over those few years, which meant that the prices of regular foodstuffs skyrocketed. People were starving, people were angry, and a lot of the aristocrats that had left France started to plot with some of the foreign powers outside of France, hoping that they could restore themselves to their position of power in France. But we also need to note that the King of France himself perhaps started to plot with some of these foreign powers as well. He never wanted his power to be limited. He is the brother-in-law of the Emperor of Austria. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was the sister of the Emperor of Austria and Joseph II. And so he felt as if he could call upon his brother-in-law to aid him in restoring himself to his absolute power. In 1791, late 1791, the King of France and his family tried to flee France to get to a border town controlled by Austria, from which they could then conspire with the Austrians to send troops in and restore Louis XVI to his absolute power. This is known as the flight to Varennes. The king and his family left in a disguise to try to sneak out of France, but they were discovered before they were able to get across the border. Once it was determined that the king was trying to leave to plot against the people of France, he and his entire family were arrested. They were placed under house arrest and then imprisoned for treason. And this will eventually lead to the king being deposed. By late 1791, he was deposed, and by early 1792, France declared themselves a republic. They would no longer be ruled by a king. The problem now was that they had just written a new constitution for France that was based on constitutional monarchy. They were supposed to have a monarch. So no longer would this constitution fit with their new government as a republic. And the king being imprisoned, his entire family being imprisoned, the king and his wife will eventually be put on trial for treason. Both of them will be beheaded as enemies of the revolution, enemies of France, ultimately. Their son, who was to be the next king, will die in prison before he is able to be executed. But this is what is going on as we enter 1792. The revolution is turning radical. This is the beginning of what is known as the radical phase of the revolution. What ends up happening at this point, after France declares itself a republic, after they had deposed the king, and especially after the king and his family are, predominantly most of his family are executed, the rest of the European powers start to take note of what's going on in France. And they are concerned that this revolutionary activity could spread outside of France and topple absolute monarchs all over Europe. This results in the creation of a European coalition against France. The new French Republic is a brand new government based on popular sovereignty, where the people are governing themselves, and they would continue to have these elections for the National Assembly as the legislature of France. But now, as this new republic is beginning, they find themselves at war with the rest of Europe, the European coalition, or at least most of Europe. Ultimately, this caused the National Assembly to create the National Convention. They will be responsible for directing the war effort that now has to be, they have to raise an army to fight against the European coalition. One of the most predominant political factions in France, the very radical faction in France known as the Jacobins, who were very much in favor of this republic, ultimately they were the ones that were able to take a lot of the seats in the National Assembly and also in the National Convention. They won a lot of votes among the regular people for running things the way they saw fit. People were scared of the war that was declared against France, and they wanted somebody in place that would be able to raise an army strong enough to defend them. And so the convention eventually creates the Committee of Public Safety, which was a committee in charge of running the war effort. They will launch a national draft. The armies now were chosen from all over the French population, and the officers would be promoted by merit rather than based just on noble blood. The Committee of Public Safety will run the war effort against the European coalition to defend France, and they were effectively able to defend France from being toppled. They saw this as an emergency situation. If they are not able to defend themselves against the European coalition, the experiment with the new French Republic will turn to dust. And so a lot of the actions of the National Convention will be to suspend the regular civil liberties of the French people that had just been enshrined in a new constitution that was written, and of course in the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. Those rights will be suspended during this emergency situation. This is something that we see happen often in times of war all over the world. Think of the Patriot Act here in America after 9/11. Suspend some of these civil liberties in this time of crisis so the government can not only defend itself against those outsiders that want to topple it, but also you can't afford to have any enemies at home working against you either. So the Committee of Public Safety, which was under the charge of the Jacobin Party. One of the heads of the Jacobin Party was a man named Maximilien Robespierre. This body eventually becomes all-powerful in France. Robespierre, as being in charge of the Committee of Public Safety, is eventually able to virtually take over the government in France as a demagogue, as a military dictator, if you will. The civil rights were suspended during this time of crisis, and Robespierre, through the Committee of Public Safety, will launch a reign of terror throughout French society to weed out any counter-revolutionary activity within France, as well as raise an army to defend France against its external enemies. The Reign of Terror will result in the deaths of thousands of Frenchmen between the end of 1792 and mid-1794. They will be able to effectively defend France against the external enemies, but at a high cost of many inside France dying under suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity. Anybody who did not support the will of Robespierre and the Jacobins was seen as being against the Republic, and ultimately they would die as a result. There was a new tool used in these political executions. It was called the guillotine. It was invented by a doctor who was very much influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment. He wanted to come up with a more humane way to execute those who were found guilty of treason. Beheading was a very common execution done for political prisoners. But using an axe sometimes required more than one swing to completely sever the head, and that was said to be cruel and unusual punishment amongst many of the philosophes who wanted prison reform. So ultimately, the guillotine was designed to lop the head off in one swoop before you could even feel it, to sever the spinal cord before you could even feel it. This particular instrument now seems pretty barbaric to us, but it's interesting to consider that it was built by a doctor named Guillotine in order to be a more humane way, based on Enlightenment principles, to execute political prisoners. The Reign of Terror will last until the middle of 1794, when finally people grew weary of the terror, and Robespierre himself, in a kind of poetic justice, will be the final victim of the terror. After the deposing of the Jacobins and Robespierre, the National Assembly of France believed that they needed to create a better kind of system in order to avoid such demagoguery from happening again. Interestingly enough, they decided to create a new kind of executive branch. Traditionally, the way it had been done during the Republic is the head of the National Assembly, meaning the majority party, was able to choose the kind of leader of the government as the executive. And of course, then the legislature, the National Assembly, also had powers. And that's how Robespierre was able to come to power, virtually as a demagogue. He was able to use the crisis situation to his advantage. After his fall, the National Assembly will decide to create a new executive branch. It's known as the Directory. And the Directory actually is a number of men are chosen to be the executive branch, rather than it just being one man. They will work hand in hand with the National Assembly. They are chosen by the National Assembly to be the executors, if you will, and they will balance, their power will be balanced with the National Assembly's legislative power. Now that that crisis was solved, there's still the issue of the war with Europe. France had done pretty well. They had been able to defend their borders against the European coalition that had formed against them. And of course, Austria and Prussia and England were the primary members of the European coalition. Eventually there will be other nations involved as well, including Russia. But ultimately they had been able to defend themselves fairly well. And one particular individual had worked his way up through the French military, since that was now possible because of promotion by merit and Enlightenment principle. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And the Directory, still having to deal with this war effort, took this war hero, Napoleon, and used him to help them gain more territories for France. The best way for France to defend itself against their enemies in the European coalition was to create a buffer zone between themselves and their enemies, and that would be by seizing more territory. Napoleon was put in charge of a number of efforts to ultimately add territory to France between the years 1799 and 1812. Ultimately, what will happen is that Napoleon will be able to use his popularity at home in France with the people once he starts having victory after victory after victory. His popularity at home allows him to eventually seize control in a coup in 1799. He's able to take control, and from that point he becomes the primary governor in France. He does it through a series of things. He ultimately becomes consul while they are supposed to be working on creating a new kind of governing system, then consul for life, and then eventually he names himself Emperor Napoleon I. Once he does this, he will continue to take more and more territory for France. Most of Europe will eventually come under the sway of France under the leadership of Napoleon. This will it'll be this way until 1812, as I said before. Between 1799 and 1812, many territories were added to France. After 1812, his empire will start to shrink with a revamped European coalition forming. And this largely happened because when he tried to invade Russia, he ran into trouble. Napoleon will be unsuccessful in forcing the Tsar of Russia to surrender to him, and ultimately this failure with this invasion of Russia in 1812 will lead to Napoleon's eventual downfall. He will lose power by 1815. He tried to come back at one point, Napoleon's 100 Days, but eventually he will lose his position. The European coalition, the revamped European coalition with Russia in it after the failed attempt to invade Russia by Napoleon, will be successful in expelling Napoleon. They exile him out of France. They do not kill him because they recognize his popularity at home with the people, if they killed him, may lead to more trouble with France. And so instead he is exiled. He will eventually die in exile. And France will actually return to a monarchy. However, it will not be like it was before. The monarchy in France will not be an absolute monarchy. Instead, they do not undo everything that had been accomplished in the French Revolution. They return France to a constitutional monarchy. They bring one of the brothers of Louis XVI to the throne, restoring the Bourbon monarchy. He will become Louis XVIII of France. He does not take the number 17 out of respect for his nephew, who would have been king, who died in prison. And ultimately, he will become the new constitutional monarch of France. There will continue to be a National Assembly that will act as the legislature. And so the revolution ultimately is complete after a series of very radical events and even a military dictator and an emperor. It will eventually come around to what they started to try to do back in 1789, create a constitutional monarchy. Napoleon's reign will have a huge impact, a massive impact, not just on France, but even on other countries throughout Europe and abroad. While he was emperor, he issued the Napoleonic Code in 1804. And what's interesting about this code is you can see how he was very much influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment, even though he's also refuting the ideals of the Enlightenment by becoming an emperor, which is an absolute ruler, which is, of course, against what the philosophes were arguing with the idea of a limited government. So he's kind of an enigma, if you will, because he both enshrines the ideals of the Revolution and of the Enlightenment, while simultaneously refuting those ideals in other ways. The Napoleonic Code in and of itself is very much based upon a lot of the Enlightenment principles. It called for the protection of property of individuals, that they did have the right to property. It did enshrine the notion of equality under the law, and it also enshrined the idea of a merit-based society. Remember, Napoleon would not have been able to become who he became had it not been for the changes that happened in French society because of the French Revolution. He was able to rise through the ranks of the military, having been an immigrant that came to France from another place. He was from Corsica. He was able to go to French military school. He was able to rise through the ranks of the French military because of the revolution going on. and ultimately become the head of the French government. Even though the Napoleonic Code did enshrine a lot of the ideals of the Enlightenment, the government in France, while Napoleon was emperor, was not a true representative government, since he ignored the elected officials in the National Assembly if they disagreed with his wishes. He ultimately was more like an enlightened despot. If they agreed with him, then he made nice with them. If they didn't agree with him, he ignored them completely. And he was able to do that because ultimately he always maintained himself in the hearts of the regular people because of his victories, because he gave glory back to France. He ultimately was able to use that popularity to propel himself into this very powerful position. Like I said before, he will lose his power in 1815. France will return to a constitutional monarchy. But what's important to note is France did not return to an absolute monarchy. That will not happen again in France. So the impact of the Enlightenment ultimately will make reforms in the French government, even after all the upheaval of the revolution itself. So now that we have discussed the American Revolution in part 1 of this lecture, and now the French Revolution in part 2 of this lecture, we now should talk a little bit about the impact that this age of revolutions will have throughout the world. In some cases, we see where there are shortcomings, especially when it comes to the plight of women and slaves. But in other cases, we will see where it becomes almost like a virus. Once reforms start happening in one place, the ideas catch on like a fever, and they continue to spread to other places. And ultimately, throughout the late 18th and through the 19th century, we will have more and more changes happen in European society as well as in the government, based upon the impact that these revolutions based on the Enlightenment will have. Equality before the law based on popular sovereignty, sounds really, really good on paper. But as we will see after these revolutions, not all of the groups in these societies have that equality. In America, there are struggles amongst the population of women and slaves. Women were not seen as equals in this new era of equality before the law. The natural rights of man did not necessarily consider women as full-fledged citizens. Women will start to push for reforms in America in the 19th century. Often they join with the abolitionist movements, those who were against slavery and wanted to end that policy in America. Many of these abolitionists argued that it seemed disingenuous to create a nation based on the ideas of equality before the law and man by his basic nature is good and should be able to act in his own best interest with the natural rights of life, liberty, and property, when some of those men were considered property themselves, the slaves. And so the abolitionists oftentimes will combine with the women's rights folks and start pushing for more reforms, deeper reforms to happen in the American government. In the 1920s, women in America will finally get the right to vote after a long, hard struggle that oftentimes led to bloodshed. Slaves will also have an equally hard struggle, many would say an even more difficult struggle than any other group. Slavery will be outlawed during the American Civil War. But even after slavery was outlawed, it wasn't like that solved all of the issues for the former slaves. The aftermath of the war proved problematic for those former slaves. New laws would be passed to make an end run around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that gave the African Americans rights. These laws, like the black codes, etc., ultimately will work to disenfranchise these freed slaves. And this will continue throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century in many cases. The struggle will continue. The Enlightenment experiment is just that. You must test it. You must continue to test it. You must continue to test it. It is an ever-going process. It's an evolution, if you will. It's important to note, however, when it comes to the slave rebellions in the French colonial territories, they had a little bit more successful of a try at it than the American slaves will have. At least it doesn't take them as long to become free. In the French colonial empire, in particular in Saint-Domingue, which is now known as Haiti, between 1791 and 1803, there was a slave rebellion against French control. This rebellion was basically for them to become a free nation based on the same principles of the Enlightenment that the French themselves and the Americans had rebelled against their rulers. Toussaint Louverture was influenced by these Enlightenment ideals after aiding the Americans in their revolution. He had learned to read, he had become enamored with the writings of the philosophes, and he will launch a massive slave rebellion in his homeland of Haiti, starting in 1791. The rebellion goes on for 12 years. This is during the time when France is also struggling internally at home. It's in the midst of the French Revolution. Between 1791 and 1794, we will note that the French Revolution becomes more and more radical. Ultimately, it culminates with the creation of the Directory and then eventually Napoleon taking over. By the time we get to the early 1800s, after Napoleon had become emperor, the problem in Haiti became far too expensive for Napoleon to worry about any longer. He saw that he had what he would consider bigger fish to fry at home in Europe, continuing to win battles against the European coalition to add territory to France. Sending men over to Haiti to try to put an end to these slave rebellions would be too costly. And so he decided to cut his losses in the French colonial empire, and the slaves in Haiti were able to form a new free Republic of Haiti by 1803. So there is a success ultimately amongst the slave population in Haiti. It will not be the same all over the French colonial empire, but this is one example where the slave rebellions worked to gain their freedom, and they based their new government on the Enlightenment principles of popular sovereignty.